community organizer at GIA, and I've been overseeing the environmental justice team for about 2 years now. I met a number of you when we did an event at Emmanuel Congregational Church, 18 months or so ago, but have been deeply invested with the environmental justices in Hartford, including the sewers and the trash plants. I was approached by Leslie Ribovich, who is overseeing the Greenberg Center for Religious Studies and Policy Life.
Religion and Public Life.
There we go. I was very close.
We're housed with Religious Studies and Public Policy and Law, so you were in the right.
I had the words.
Yeah,
not the
right
right
words.
order. At Trinity College, and she connected me with these two amazing seniors at Trinity who've spent the last year really diving into the history and anecdotes of the intersection of religion and environmentalism, and I thought this would be a great group to hear their year-long research project. So, Grace Sullivan and Surya.
All right, well, that was basically everything I was going to say. I'm just going to keep you going here. So to open this presentation, we want to set the tone and sort of ground everything that follows in reality. This isn't just a theoretical exploration of environmental justice. The project's rooted in real people, real places, and real consequences. This slide features quotes from an interview with a Hartford resident that was conducted by an organization at Trinity College as well. The person who was interviewed, her story offers a powerful window into what environmental injustice looks like, not just as theory or statistics, but sort of as like a lived daily experience. She begins by explaining how asthma is an almost universal condition in her community. She says, I have asthma, my sister has asthma, we all have asthma. You can correlate it to living in congested cities. In her neighborhood, asthma isn't rare, it's something that's expected. And it's just a constant presence that's woven into everyday life. She goes on to describe how even a sudden smell can trigger a health emergency. There was a smell, it triggered me immediately. I had to close all my windows and get my inhaler. That's the quote in the middle right there. Sort of throughout the interview, she describes how something as simple as opening the window to cool down on a warm day becomes a risk for her rather than a moment of relief. It becomes something she has to worry about with her asthma and her own health conditions that have resulted as a result of the environment around her. And finally, she shares the helplessness of watching her sister suffer as well. She says, my sister particularly, she has it worse than I do. When she gets her asthma attacks, you feel like you can't do anything. It's helpless. These aren't isolated experiences. They reflect a broader systemic pattern. In Hartford, environmental injustice isn't an abstract issue. It's immediate, it's embodied, and it's impacting people in their everyday lives.
Excuse me, what is that building?
The Mira energy
the
plant.
jet turbine building at the Mira facility in the south end.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great way to open up our whole presentation, and so we'll continue on with a bit more of a broader look at some of these issues, starting with the term environmental racism, which is defined as the intentional placement of polluting waste facilities in communities of color and low-income communities. And it's important to note that it really is a form of systemic racism that disproportionately affects these communities. And to start, we'll begin with some national trends of these, and we'll move through how those impact us on a more local scale. Starting with the history of redlining. Redlining was a government policy in the 1930s that systematically denied mortgages and financial assistance to Black and other minority communities. It's an 80-year-old racially discriminatory policy that still affects our cities today. And there are several studies that confirm the history of redlining to disproportionate impacts of an exposure to higher pollution rates. Redlining informed things like the highway placement throughout the country. For example, in Syracuse, New York, I-84 was place in a location that separated public housing from white and us in Connecticut and within Hartford. Again, starting with redlining. This is a redlining map of Hartford, and as you can see, the east end was mostly redlined. The west side of the city is all green lined, and we know that that still influences us today. West Hartford is pretty affluent, and it started that way back when. Hartford's East End neighborhood were redlined because of the Black and Irish populations at the time. And Hartford's a pretty good example of a striking like city versus suburban redlining differences. And it really created the structure for the racially segregated Hartford that we see today. The redlining in Hartford also influenced the placement of I-84 in the city. I was fortunate to listen to a whole podcast about the way that I-84 totally amputated part of the city. During America's Gilded Age, Hartford was one of the wealthiest cities in the nation, and as time went on and highway placement kind of facilitated white flight to the suburbs, and it created an obvious divide between Hartford's North End minority communities and everywhere else. Now Hartford is a place where money's made, but not really locally invested. It also influences the placement of hazardous facilities in Connecticut itself. Connecticut right now has 176 potentially hazardous facilities, and almost 25% of these are located in Hartford's major cities, where there are already high poverty rates and concentrations of very vulnerable populations. For example, Hartford has 3 polluting industries and New Haven has 12 of them. A good example of this is the Hartford MIRA Trash to Energy plant. MIRA stands for the Materials Innovation and Recycling Authority. It was a pollutive industrial trash incineration facility located in Hartford South Meadows neighborhood in the East End. And it processed 1/3 of Connecticut's trash. So that means that very affluent white neighborhoods were sending their trash to Hartford to be incinerated and polluting the community nearby. It is a really terrifying example of environmental exploitation. It was shut down, the plant itself was shut down in July of 2022 thanks to Interfaith collaboration. And the site is still waiting to be remediated. Another great example of environmental racism in Hartford is the flooding that happens in the North End. Miss Sharon Lewis, who just so happens to be the director of the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice, lives in the North End and her house was flooded. And she now has a lawsuit filed against the Metropolitan District Commission and the city. She's looking for compensation for property damage. Advocates like her and other North End residents are fighting for solutions, and they claim that if these problems were happening in more affluent neighborhoods, the problem would be resolved much faster than it currently is. An important thing to note about these systemic environmental hazards is that they result in really disparate health impacts. Exposure to different types of pollution can cause increased mortality, cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, strokes, and increased emergency department visits.
And so I'm going to talk a bit about just sort of the disproportionate allocation of green spaces in Hartford. On the surface, Hartford seems ahead actually of a lot of US cities. About 37% of the city is designated as green space, which is much more than other cities, like bigger ones, especially like New York, for example. But those numbers hide a harsher truth, that being that access to that green space isn't particularly equal. The same Hartford resident we heard from earlier in the slide I was talking about describes the stark contrast between her childhood growing up in the North End versus where she lives now in the South End. She says, so when I lays bare a geographic and racial divide. In Hartford, your zip code and thus your socioeconomic status often tend to determine whether you grow up surrounded by nature or cut off from it entirely. And this isn't just about aesthetics. Green space is a public health resource, which is like something that a lot of people tend to neglect, actually, especially in debates about like overdevelopment, in debates about housing development. Like the green space that's being lost, it's not necessarily just like an aesthetic thing that's being lost, but it's a health resource. One study, for example, found that people living near green vacant lots experienced a 41% drop in depression. 41% is a pretty significant number. These spaces also foster connection, like social cohesion. They foster safety. Crime tends to drop significantly the more green space there is in a given area. And really importantly, especially for the Hartford area, is upward social mobility. Green spaces have been directly correlated to being able to upwardly socially mobilize yourself within a generation. And so, in other words, they can be a valuable tool to aid in and sort of help in ending cycles of poverty, which are really prevalent in this area. But yeah, those benefits aren't distributed evenly. As that same resident put it, if you're low in income, odds are you're not having access to any of that green space. So while official statistics paint a picture of progress with Hartford having so much green space, the lived reality tells a different story, a story of environmental privilege shaped by class and neighborhood lines. What we see here is not just a gap in access to parks, it's a gap in opportunity, in health, and in dignity. This is just a reminder of those quotes from earlier, and like it's exactly the lack of green space that this resident didn't grow up with. It's that lack of green space that results in things like this. Also, like what Grace was talking about earlier, where you have like a third of an area's trash being processed in the same part. I mean, it makes it difficult for it makes it difficult for people to breathe the air outside, simply put. The same people that conducted this interview, they conducted other interviews with literally school children who, on certain days, if it was too warm and too musty, they literally couldn't go outside for recess because the air quality was so bad. But I feel like it's not something that gets a lot of attention in this area. It's like a school kid not being able to go outside because of their air quality, but it is a big issue.
So we've laid the groundwork for these trends of environmental racism throughout the country that play out right here where we all live. And so now we'll kind of pivot into how groups, especially faith-based ones, organize on these environmental issues. Starting with an example in Bridgeport. Bridgeport's Mount Trashmore was a 3-story high waste dump in the Black and Latin East End neighborhood. In the 80s and 90s, there were several protests that ended with the shutdown of this facility. And part of that was in large thanks to the East End Baptist Church, where because of their proximity to this facility, it impacted church attendance. So the congregation and the pastor organized protests, marches, and garnered a lot of media and political support, and it successfully shut the facility down. Thanks to even more long-term community organizing events, the land is now set to be remediated, and it's going to be a wellness agricultural center called Mount Grovemore. Mm-hmm. And now we'll pivot a little bit more into some examples from the greater Hartford area. Beginning with the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network, or IREJN. It was the nation's first ever interfaith environmental group, and it started right here in Connecticut. They work on several different types of initiatives, from houses of worship and green sanctuaries to try to help houses of worship and their congregations to be more sustainable. They also organize around food insecurity and energy efficiency. They do quite a bit of legislative work as well, like bill tracking and postcard initiatives. And moving forward, they would like to develop their network by reaching out to more clergy members and encouraging community engagement. Two other examples of congregational leaders stepping up to lead. Protests of Hartford land. Dr. Hamid at the Berlin Mosque and the Muslim Association of Greater Hartford, they advocated for the remediation of Hartford Black and Muslim community.
So then a large part of my research with this project, it focused on sort of like a more academic intersection between religion and environmentalism, sort of like, you know, what are the dynamics that beneath people's environmental attitudes, and like how does religion influence them? And so that's what I'm going to get into now. So at first glance, faith and environmentalism can seem at odds, especially within the polarized landscape of America today. Surveys show that certain religious groups, particularly evangelical Protestants, often express lower concern for environmental issues, and in some cases outright skepticism toward climate science. It's easy to assume that the skepticism stems directly from the religion itself, right? Like, you know, because they're religious, they must just not like the environment, but it's not the full picture at all. The disconnect is way less about theology, and it's way more about how that theology has been shaped. Climate change is entirely under God's control, and so that belief led to people like resigning themselves from environmental or climate issues. But others that were in the exact same community, they believed that caring for the earth was a sacred duty, or an extension of their faith and values. And so while religion can be used to justify inaction, which I think is what's often portrayed in media and by just sort of like the American political landscape at the moment, religion can just as powerfully be a source of environmental responsibility and action as well. And that's important to remember. In the end, it's not the religion itself that's at odds with environmental care or concern, but it's how that religion is lived and interpreted. So now I'm just going to get more into my research. This is specifically concerning the intersection between Christianity and environmentalism. So there are a lot of scriptural pieces that have been interpreted, around the world as sort of supporting environmental initiatives. In Genesis 2:15, for example, we read, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." This verse has been embraced by many evangelical environmentalists who interpret it as a divine call to stewardship and a responsibility entrusted by God into people. In Psalm 24, Scripture declares the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. This has often been read as a reminder that the earth belongs to God, not humanity, which is sort of a call to caretakers, not owners. And in Romans 8, Paul writes of creation groaning under the weight of human sin. Many see this as a spiritual metaphor for environmental degradation and a cautionary reflection on human impact. Taken together, these verses have been interpreted by some as forming a theological basis for environmental concern, one that aligns care for the earth with Christian moral and spiritual values. The point here is that it's not necessarily the religion, again, that's fundamentally at odds with environmentalism. It's the other factors that I mentioned, like politics and specific interpretation. And so now, like, way more about how that theology has been shaped by external forces, like political polarization, these people's cultural identity, and specific interpretations of different religious scripture. So religion itself isn't necessarily...
Repeat those, please.
Yeah. The disconnect between the sort of religion and environmental attitudes, it's less about theology and it's more about how that theology has been shaped by external forces, including political polarization, the cultural identity of these groups, and the specific interpretation of religious scripture and doctrine that they read. So they're how they choose to read the words that are on the paper. But so the point is that the religion itself isn't necessarily inherently in conflict with environmental care. And in fact, in many faith traditions, they contain deep moral teachings that emphasize stewardship, interconnectedness, and reverence of creation. It's essential not to generalize, though. Beliefs and practices vary widely across and within denominations. just sort of like I was talking about with the personal interpretation of words. So there was a 2018 study that captured this complexity. In one Christian community, some believers, often described as religious fatalists, viewed climate change. And so now, like, I don't really need to get into this too much, but these are just sort of examples of different groups that have sort of taken this environmental initiative based on these scriptural foundations. And these slides, so these are all slides, by the way, from a much larger presentation. We're giving a sort of abridged version of it at the moment, but
Would you be able to share the slides with us?
100%, and they will also be uploaded onto the Trinity College site. But it's a much larger presentation that goes into many different religions, many other examples of issues in the greater Hartford area, and they're all very interesting. But so now I'm just going to turn to a different but equally profound spiritual framework for understanding environmental care, just based on what I just talked about. This is dark green religion. It's a term coined by a scholar named Bron Taylor, who I think is at the University of Florida, because we met him.
What's his name again?
Bron Taylor, B-R-O-N Taylor, yeah. Which, you know, a person we met and had some great conversations with. But dark green religion encourages a re-examination of existing faith traditions. It's highlighting the spiritual teachings within those traditions, like Christianity, that honor the earth. It invites believers to rediscover their own scriptures, rituals, and values through an ecological lens, right? So, like the examples of scripture I just discussed, sort of interpreting them in a way that encourages ecological care. By elevating the earth to a place of spiritual significance, the worldview doesn't replace religion, but it calls people back to something ancient and often overlooked. The idea that caring for the earth is not only ethical, but it's sacred. This isn't a sort of rejection of religion at all, it's a reclamation of it. Dark green religion builds on the sacred values found in scriptures, myths, and teachings across all religions and faiths, calling us to see the earth not as separate from the divine, but as part of it. I think today there's a lot of belief of like human dominion over the earth, sort of humans being able to do their own thing. But I think historically that wasn't always the case. It was just sort of as the world became a bit more secular that turn happened. But it wasn't always the case at all. The environment was something a long time ago that was encouraged to be protected because of God's role in the creation of that environment. This challenges the dominant human-centered worldview and offers a spiritual ethic of interconnectedness and humility, one in which caring for the planet is a sacred responsibility. This perspective has inspired radical environmental movements, influenced artists and scientists, and even shaped global policy conversations. In a time of ecological crisis, dark green religion offers something powerful and urgently needed: a return to reverence, a reawakening of spiritual connection to the earth, and a call to protect it, not just because it sustains us, but because it's sacred under those religious ideologies.
Excuse me, I just have one question.
Yeah.
When you went to this topic about dark green religion, the one before it had been Islam and environmentalism.
Yes.
And you didn't mention anything, I don't think.
Yeah.
I didn't catch it.
Right. Yeah, right. So that's
Islam.
so that is sort of what I was talking about earlier. There are a bunch of slides that are in a much larger presentation that we're sort of giving an abridged version of at the moment. But like in Islam, there are a lot of, similar to Christianity, there are a lot of scriptural foundations that encourage environmental stewardship. Yeah, it might be. In the Quran, for similar to like the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. There are similar groups, Islamic groups in the United States and beyond that have taken on they've sort of adopted these interpretations of their scripture and used them as a basis to carry forward environmental action and gain a large following.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, of course. And again, I think we will definitely make sure to be sending the full version of our presentation so that everyone has access to it.
It's in the presentation email now.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. Just to wrap this up, we wanted to end on one last example of interfaith environmental organizing. with the Greater Hartford Interfaith Action Alliance, or GIA. They were established in 2019 when Hartford Center for Leadership and Justice wanted to start working on interfaith issues to build the leadership base and address social issues through that avenue. They've got a variety of member organizations from Christian denominations to Jewish and Muslim groups. And every year or so, they come out with their action campaigns. For example, one of their recent ones is to combat racial and religious hate. And to work on these issues, they organize at the community and local neighborhood level. What brought us to this point was GIA's work on the Mira waste-to-energy plant. This was part of their environmental justice campaign, and they successfully shut the plant down in July of 2022.
Right now, there's a lot of debate over how to remediate the site, which is in the South Meadows redevelopment survey that describes the different options. And it's a very characteristic example of interfaith community organizing around environmental justice issues. And it was absolutely the inspiration for this project. And we wanted to end on this quote from a GIA member that was in Connecticut Public Radio, which kind of encapsulates why this type of work is important to both do and understand. He said, "We won. This was a fight and a win over how we use our resources to care for our communities and how and who controls the land." Thank you. We're all yours if you have any questions.
Yeah.
Are there good ideas on the table about how the community would like the Mira plant to be remediated, or we haven't gotten that far yet?
There are several options. Do you want to?
So I don't know if anyone saw the Hartford Current yesterday, but there was a huge piece in the Current about the trash incinerator being just a piece of the 1,000 acres that are down in the South Meadows that some lawmakers are looking for to redevelop, including the airport and regional farmers market. And right now, there is at least some push for the most expansive remediation options, most expensive as well, but for residential use to create its own neighborhood. And I think that there is some pushback on if that's the best option for the community, because it involves probably decades of hauling out contaminated dirt, and what does that do to the air quality in the interim, and where does that contaminated soil go? What GIA is focused on is not so much the remediation itself, or the levels. We want certainly to uplift the community voices there, but that Mira will dissolve on June 30th of this year, and all of their reserves go to the Department of Administrative Services on the state level, including their $63 million in reserves. And GIA is advocating for that $63 million to remain in Hartford, to expand what remediation looks like, not just for the land, but for the people who experience the harm, to create an environmental justice fund that could go and serve the community and some of those health disparities.
Is your proposal in writing somewhere? For example, I'd like to go to my legislators and underscore reports of your proposal.
Absolutely, I can do one pager.
Maybe we can all
Yeah.
make it available.
Is that on the GIA website?
We launched our new website on Friday, so it will be there, but I can make sure that this group gets it all.
And can you clarify, in 2022, when the Mira plant closed down, was that really a matter of interfaith groups advocating for the closing, or was it just a financial consideration that they didn't want to continue because it would have taken so much more to make the machinery work well, to have it be, you know, efficient?
I think it's a combination of those. Neighborhood organizing, faith-based organizing was certainly responsible for closing the landfill up in the north end in 2008. And I think they saw a similar pattern happening with advocacy. And there were interfaith groups that actually held a funeral for the Mirror plant when it closed, in the symbolism of it ending. But there had been a disinvestment by suburban towns to the plant over a year so that they couldn't keep up the regular maintenance. There was also an investment of about $200 million from Mira into Enron prior to the collapse of towns to the plant over a year so that they couldn't keep up the regular maintenance. There was also an investment of about $200 million from Mira into Enron prior to the collapse that they lost a lot of that investment.
Is there any talk in GIA or attention in GIA about using some of the resources around the closing of Mira to handle trash in a different way? Currently, as you probably know, 41% of all the trash that's destined for the landfill in Connecticut is being trucked out of state. And there are lots of ways to include food composting. There are systems that can work to cut that number in half that's going to the landfill. So is any is any activity or thought
I mean, I have
being
seen
used GIA to leverage some of that?
a rest of some of those. So,
Bless you.
I believe it's tomorrow night is a public hearing around a new plant in Plainfield that they are, that the state is looking at for smart technology for another trash to energy plant. And Plainfield, while not racially diverse, is socioeconomically diverse. And it is another example of environmental injustice who has the burden of these large plants.
I would love to add that one of the solutions to, instead of incineration, is like reducing the amount of waste up front, which
Right.
compost does help with.
It does.
20%.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And rather not and more, but there was like the West Hartford composting
Yeah.
trial
Yeah.
that didn't follow through.
Which had excellent results,
Absolutely.
cut the amount of trash going in the landfill in half, and then just fell on deaf ears in West Hartford.
Followed.
Yeah.
Well, West Hartford was awarded the grant and they turned it down.
Right,
Yeah.
correct.
So it seems like there's a translation obstacle there that we're trying to do when we try to introduce a zero waste or reduced waste strategy, because the way I think about it is kind of put it frankly, like all the people who make money based off of how much trash we produce and where it goes and the transportation of it, that source kind of goes away when you transition the system.
Some of them actually would advocate more sensible way of doing things and are frustrated by the way the trash haulers are frustrated by the way things are now, and some would advocate that they know it's done in compost and all that kind of thing.
Question. I believe with the closing of the mirror, most of our trash is going out of the state. Are we finding environmental racism motivating where that's going to? Are we going to poorer states, poorer neighborhoods in the poorer states? Right? Is that are we learning from our environmental racism in the state of the mirror plant? Are we, doing anything to, because I believe we're just shipping out of state to Ohio and Pennsylvania, I believe, correct?
Most of our trash is ending up at the Keystone landfill, which is almost the size of Hartford itself. It is not a hugely residential area, but it is a very poor area. And it used to be green space.
Our toxic waste is going to West Virginia.
And all the CO2 that's emitted along the way.
I just want to say both of you, because that was amazing, and we love the work that you are putting out there for people your age, is what we need going forward. I'm particularly interested in the redlining and the environmental racism piece that you spoke about, because I remember living in Chicago 50 years ago, and Gary, Indiana was just south and east of the wind started tearing it down. They called it the land of the red snow. People couldn't even hang the laundry up without it becoming bright red. So I'm wondering, going in speaking about this environmental racism, if there's a movement to get it, how do you do that? How do you change the focus to get it where it needs to go and not where it's been going for 100 years? How does that work? Is it true that?
I think part of it is shifting the policy focus toward like the location of where exactly these sorts of landfills and waste management sites are going. I also think a big part of the mobilization is really through sort of like joining groups like who often do successfully advocate for exactly these sorts of issues, just like we do. But I think it's a difficult effort that requires a lot of mobilization, sort of like grassroots organization on the ground. And a lot of involvement in, I think people underestimate how important local legislators often are. I think people like to jump to federal legislation a lot. But a lot of people, one, don't realize that like federal legislators are much harder to get access to, get to know first, like just sort of get through to it all. And two, a lot of the time there are a lot more obstacles in instituting a federal policy than there are state policy. So like people don't give enough credit to like state governments for how actually bipartisan they often are. A lot of times they're not nearly as polarized as politics on the national level. I think a lot more can get done on the state level if there's more advocacy on the state level. I think people are too quick to jump to the federal level, but if that mobilization happens on the state level and the local level, I think a lot more can get done than people think that they can get done.
If you're curious about other cities throughout the United States, as you mentioned, I can't click on it, but this link will take you to a digitized repository. It's a map that's really easy to use of all of these redlining maps throughout the United States. We got to use it in one of my classes, and it's a great way to kind of look at how cities have been redlined and exactly where they were. So if you're curious about the local impact nationally, kind of a weird way to phrase that, but it's a great resource.
This is a good ad for Indivisible,
Right.
because they are all about local and state governments. So
Right.
I think
It really is important. I genuinely I've interned for the state government where I'm from, and I think people would be really shocked to see how bipartisan it is compared to national politics. The media doesn't give it attention, obviously, because it's not divisive enough for it to be entertaining for people, right? But I think if you walk into a state legislature, for example, Democrats and Republicans tend to be friends a lot more often than people think, and they're willing to get a lot more done than people think. And their policies tend to have a lot more direct consequences on the people of the state than a federal policy might. And also state legislators are much easier to access than people realize. Like, if you give a call to your state office, it's their chief of staff that's often picking up, who's talking to the legislator, like, literally daily. And so, I mean, you're literally one person away from getting through to the person who's making the legislation. Often it is the chief of staff actually making the legislation. It's just the senator that looks at it and, proposes it. But it's much easier than trying to contact like your federal representative or senator and having like 8 people in between before you get to them. And it can have a lot of direct impact. So I think it's definitely something to focus on for sure.
And Worcester is a really good comparison to Hartford.
They're very similar in demographics to Hartford, and they've done a lot of really smart pivots to reduce waste. And one of the things that they've implemented really successfully for probably like close to 10 years is pay as you throw, which encourages people to really think about what is waste, what is recyclable, what is compostable.
That's what killed West Hartford. The voters didn't want pay as you throw.
And I think it's a lot of like how it's packaged, because like if your waste is part of your taxes, you think it's free, but it's not. It's just already in a bill. We had residents in, I forget now which town, were able to get composting that happened there because they messaged it as bear protection. That if you want less intrusive
Interesting.
wildlife, get your compost out of the waste basket and into its own secure bucket. So it was no longer about waste; it was about safety.
Nice pivot. I want to say a couple of things. One is last night we saw an amazing national webinar by Focus on Democracy about how the fact that the Republicans have really, really stepped up their media messaging on platforms for low-income people who don't read traditional or watch traditional media, and that we've got to do the same thing. And
we saw the results of the last election. Sure.
Yeah. So I wonder, I just want to put it out there, if you or others who know can think about how do we get messaging out to towns in Connecticut on social media platforms that are not the ones that this community usually uses. That would be a really big impact.
So was the media used not the way that they communicated? It was very simple.
It was on TikTok. It was with gamers. It was with podcasts.
Yeah,
all kinds of things. And the fact that Kamala Harris didn't go on Joe Rogan's.
Right. I think that was a big deal. That was much bigger. I think I have experience with this sort of politics. I'm going to say I'm like an expert on anything, but I do think my analysis of the last election was that I think where Democrats really faltered, it was almost like their biggest fault was like the personability of the candidates almost. Like I think as much as they didn't go on podcasts and things like that, I think the large reason for it is because they wouldn't have been as successful doing it. And I think you need, for Democrats to be more successful in upcoming elections, I think Democrats need a sort of, they're going to need a new face who is personable. The number one decider often after an election and post-election interviews, the number one thing that makes people vote for a candidate is not their policy. It's not anything. It's literally, who do I think I'd have fun getting a beer with, right? That's literally almost every presidential election. That's the post-election determining it. That's it. Who can I have a beer with? Bill Clinton, for example. Everyone thought they could have a beer with. And I think Democrats right now on the national level are lacking the candidates that people feel as though they can get.
So let's go back to the state level. I'd love to know how long it took Bridgeport that had grassroots resistance to that trash mill. How many years did it take them to stop it?
We don't get this.
82 weeks. How long did it take? That doesn't say. 82 weeks.
It's the 82 weekly marches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Weekly.
I think it took longer. I would expect it to be longer than